Everything is Mental, the Christof Koch and Heather Berlin discussion on consciousness. The clips you're about to see were captured using Ray-Ban Meta smart glasses. These glasses record only short bursts of video, so I wasn't able to film the full conversation. But what I did manage to record are powerful, almost koan-like glimpses into one of the most profound debates of our time. Is consciousness fundamental to reality, or is it an emergent property of the physical brain? Think of these fragments as intellectual snapshots, rich with meaning, offering flashes of insight into how we might think about the mind and its mysterious origins. My apologies for having the video cut off, just as things were getting heated, and for the occasional awkward head movements. I didn't want to film with my iPhone, given where I was sitting, since that would have been awkward and invasive. If you occasionally hear weird crackling sound, it is probably not from the fireplace, but from a bag of ice on my right thigh that was trying its very best, and not succeeding very well, to alleviate some of the pain from my months-long, yes, far too long, sciatica. What makes this conversation especially compelling is that Christof Koch, long known for his materialist approach, has now shifted his stance dramatically. To the surprise of many, including myself, he now proclaims that everything is mental. On the other side, Heather Berlin maintains a scientific rigor and openness, arguing that there's no compelling reason to doubt consciousness arises from physical processes, though she's fully willing to engage with alternate perspectives. Before diving in, some context. This dialogue took place during the Brain Mind Collective gathering held March 21st to 23rd, 2025. The event brought together 150 of the world's leading scientists, thinkers, and visionaries to explore topics ranging from neuroscience and AI to the very fabric of conscious experience. The setting was intimate and inspiring, hosted at the private residence of one of the event's co-founders, whose generosity and warmth set the tone for the entire weekend. I was lucky to have a front-row seat, literally on the couch right in front of the speakers. Esther Dyson sat to my right. Further along, you may spot Van Jones, the well-known commentator and philanthropist. To my left were several brilliant minds, scientists, doctors, thinkers, whose names I wish I could recall. I considered filming the full session with my iPhone, but that felt a bit intrusive. Instead, I opted for my Meta glasses. Before recording, I personally asked Heather Berlin for her permission. She not only agreed, but encouraged me to share. On a personal note, this event was deeply meaningful to me. I've been immersed in the study of consciousness for decades. Back in the 1980s, I was teaching at Warren College and pursuing my PhD at UC San Diego, when Francis Crick lived in La Jolla and the Churchlands, Paul and Patricia, had just joined the faculty. My wife, Dr. Andrea Diem, was also at UCSD at the time, working as V.S. Ramachandran's research assistant on visual perception. Those were heady days. The scientific study of consciousness was just beginning to break into the mainstream, and I was very much on the romantic Vedantic side of things, inclined to Advaita Vedanta and the Ramana Maharshi school of thought. I remember vividly when one of my students, Tom Wegener, a surfer and a sharp thinker, would bounce between Patricia Churchland's class and mine. After learning about eliminative materialism, we're just 3 pounds of glorious tissue. He'd come to my class, where I'd argue that everything arises within consciousness itself. Back and forth we went, volleying perspectives across disciplines and worldviews. That back and forth didn't end in stalemate. It sparked transformation. Churchland's ideas profoundly reshaped my thinking, leading me toward an intertheoretic approach that embraces both the mystical and the material. Later, I was also influenced by E. O. Wilson's consilience, a call to unify knowledge across domains, though I understood the resistance from the humanities to such an approach. To better set the stage here, I thought it would be wise to include brief biographies of the two conversants. Dr. Heather Berlin is a neuroscientist, clinical psychologist, and associate clinical professor of psychiatry and neuroscience at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai in New York. Her research focuses on the neural basis of impulsive and compulsive disorders, consciousness, unconscious processes, and creativity. Clinically, she treats anxiety, mood, and compulsive disorders across the lifespan, integrating cognitive behavioral therapy, mindfulness, and humanistic approaches. Christof Koch is a meritorious investigator at the Allen Institute. He earned his PhD from the Max Planck Institute for Biological Cybernetics and was a professor at Caltech for over 2 decades. Koch joined the Allen Institute in 2011, where he now leads efforts to map and understand the vast diversity of neurons in mammalian brains. His passion lies in decoding the building blocks of perception, memory, and consciousness. Sit back and enjoy the to and fro of brilliant minds engaging in the greatest mystery of all, our consciousness.
And explaining how these conscious experiences arise and are different and above and beyond the mere agitation of neurons. I mean, there's all sort of stuff agitating in my body, but it only seems to be agitation of parts of my brain, the neurocognitive of consciousness, that seem to be associated with this mental. And how does the mental arise? Philosophy has been utterly unable to deal with that. The attempts include simply canceling, trying to cancel consciousness, gaslighting, us into believing, well, you aren't really conscious, and then you're just totally confused about it. But consciousness in itself doesn't exist. So trying to cancel, to eliminate, to deny that it has any causal power, very common move, right? Consciousness, even if it exists, doesn't have any causal powers. But none of that has actually solved the problem. Intelligence and our ability to manipulate the environment, which is behavior, which is separate from consciousness.
So would you say that, so I'm just taking like a more grander perspective, right? Because this is where I think I'm filled with wonder, is that, you look at the universe, we're like a speck of dust in the universe, right? Yet with this little tiny speck of dust, we can have these concepts that are beyond us. It's unbelievable. So you would think, God, could evolution really have created matter to organize itself in such a way that it understands itself, which is phenomenal. But the question is it, so do you think consciousness exists elsewhere in the universe and then what kind of matter needs to be around for it to instantiate itself?
Well, it didn't instantiate itself.
Okay.
Fundamentally, the only thing that exists per Schopenhauer, if I channel for a moment Bernardo Castro, or his philosophical predecessor after Schopenhauer in the 19th century, what truly exists is mind. Mind may be very primitive. You can think of it as a mind of God, but it's not. I've experienced something that simply, that tells me completely unambiguously, without any question, that ultimately reality is mental. That's just the way it is. You don't have to believe it. I don't have to even convince you. This was my experience. This is what I had experienced. By the way, how many of you had what one might call mystical experience? All right, wow. Well, there you know. And so now the challenge is, if you really take that serious, right, that when you encounter its ultimate reality, sort of you feel you come to the center of the universe and you finally understand it, although it's ineffable, it's difficult to put into words. If it's really true that fundamentally everything is mental, is a mind, we still have science, and science is the most powerful technology.
In the field, this hard-nosed, physicist by training, German, very.
Oh, there it is.
Very. I mean, that explains everything. And his perspective was very much looking at this physical details, looking at the the dendrites. What was your PhD on? It was the
dendritic architecture of neurons.
The dendritic architecture of neurons. So he was looking very much at the physicality of the brain and trying to understand how this maps on to consciousness, the neural basis of consciousness. So we became friends. We co-taught courses together on the neural basis of consciousness in Israel and in Switzerland. Now I'm jumping to recent times. Suddenly Christof is starting to take this alternative view.
Yeah.
Which he's going to go on now to explain. where our roles have kind of shifted, because I was always asking about, but what about this, the mystery, and can't we find consciousness outside of a system that has mechanisms like a neuromorphic computer that does the same things as neurons do, that has the same kind of integration of information, but it has to be a physical system for there to be consciousness. This is Christof's argument, if I got it correct. So, sort of, okay. But then that's a physicalism explanation, is it not?
Well, it uses, yes, so this is within integrated information theory of consciousness. As I said, IIT is not an idealist theory, Heather. It has idealist elements. In a sense, it's first and foremost, it takes consciousness, what truly exists is consciousness. But then there's a substrate, and it asks, what is the character that the substrate has to be in order to
So do you need a substrate to have mental...
Yes, of course.
Okay, so there needs to be a substrate.
As I said, without my brain, Christof isn't going to be there. There's no spooky soul.
So where's the non-physical part of this? It's in the heart, it's in the jump from the physical to the mental?
No, it's a mental.
It's mental creating physical? What is it?
Yes, ultimately the physical.
Just to put my cards on the table up front, I believe that all manifestations of consciousness are rooted in the nervous system. So I'm not on Christof's side.
So you're right.
And I'm not going to ask Christof why the change of mind. I mean, I've read your books, Christof. I've been to your talks and so forth. You used to think like a bad cop. Now you think otherwise.
I'm still a cop. I'm just now a good cop. That's the difference.
You'll say, you reach the truth through rational reasoning. But, that's fine. But
when you try to understand what is attention, try to understand. This is not being a car mechanic. This is understanding something very fundamental about the brain, to understand what is attention, how do we make a decision. And there's been, I would say that people are looking less at it from a physiological point of view now, and more trying to throw AI at it, which I think will do nothing to understand questions like this. And so...
instrumental way. It doesn't tell us anything about fundamental reality, but it's exceedingly good at manipulating reality and giving rise to mRNA vaccines and quantum computers and nuclear bombs and all of that. So how can we use that, but also combine it with what I think is a better, simply description of the universe? So, and I call this project beyond realism, beyond physicalism.
Okay.
What is consciousness? How is it compatible with physics and what we know about physics? And how does it relate to these experiences that many people have had that have an ultimately authority? So there's a famous experiment in cognitive neuroscience called Mary, the color scientist. Have you heard about it? So you take this woman, Mary, she grows up inside this box, it's all gray. All right? But she knows everything about it. That's what Schopenhauer calls urge, will, which expresses itself at the base level in the laws of physics. At the highest level, it expresses itself through evolution and the drive of all of us to always achieve without having any specific goal in mind. Right? That's sort of this very primitive urge that mind has imbued. No.
A
non-physicalist.
I just think what we're defining as consciousness has gotten.
I hate that word physicalist anyway.
Okay.
It's just energy and matter are intertwined anyway. So how can you define something as physical?
Definition matter with no definition in physicalism, which I agree. Boston Frosten makes the same point. There's no definition of the physical. It's actually scientifically ridiculous to assume a position whose conceptual content cannot even be agreed upon by a room.
Right. But everything depends on mind.
Right.
And then you have a manifestation of those minds in all of our brains, in the brains of other animals, not just humans. But animals maybe throughout the animal kingdom, maybe even in plants, we don't know.
But everything depends on mind, but some things, in addition to that dependency on mind, have their own minds.
Well,
and that's what a lot of us are interested in, that subset.
Oh yes, and me too. We studied in the clinic all of that because that's ultimately the only source of knowledge we have.
In the interest of time,
yeah.
I'm going to do an audible in a way I think you're both right. I think both Christof and you either need a breakout room of your own for the next session.
But first, she had a question.
Well, no, but we're out of time now.
Oh yeah. Can I do at least a show of hands? Who is still a physicalist, materialist? Who? Raise your hand.
And it's Christof's fault.
Half of these people are students.
I have a motto, entertaining without endorsing, and I think that's really important, that it's okay to entertain these things without making yourself necessarily fringe. And I think we really, given this conversation, we really need to be entertaining these types of things. Bernardo Castro has a very nice idealist theory which basically sort of likens us all to individual personas in a larger brain, very much like dissociative identity disorder can have individual consciousnesses within the same mind. And that view, which I think is a defensible one, suggests that telepathy should be possible, that it should be possible to get breakdowns between the different personas. And so this sort of relegation of investigation of parapsychological research to basically making you fringe and making you marginalized in the mainstream, I think is really problematic, because that's where that might persuade you, right?
That we don't directly access. It follows natural laws, not spooky, it's not God, it's not supernatural, it's still a form of naturalism.
This is basically the Deepak argument, is that the mental creates the, it is, I mean, it's the mental manifest creates the physical, yeah.
I mean, listening to this debate, it reminds me a little bit of Thomas Nagel, who's a philosopher in New York, who kind of did what Christof has done, I think, gone from very materialist ideas to more metaphysical. His basic idea, and it's a while since I read the book, was that
As I like to be a bat.
it's a fundamental property of matter. Consciousness is a fundamental property of matter, and the evidence for that is that consciousness evolves through evolution, and evolution only acts on things that are tangible.
Maybe are interested in consciousness that even in Christof's perspective, there's stuff that doesn't have this other property, and then there's stuff that does have this other property. Like people have this other thing, which is consciousness, let's call it consciousness 2. So there's consciousness 1 that everything has, because it's all just by virtue of being the product of the supermind or whatever it is. And then there's the consciousness 2, which is only had by a certain subset of things, which are like animals and other, maybe AIs and maybe aliens. Right? So I think that's why there's a lot of talking past each other, because some people in the room are interested in consciousness 2, the things that stones don't have, but people do. And then Christof is pointing out that there's also some kind of consciousness that stones and people share.
No, so that's panpsychism. I'm not a pan. So this, for example, I don't think this or this is conscious, to give you an example. However, from the physical construct that follow from mind. Mind is timeless, spaceless. In that sense, it doesn't have an end, it doesn't have a beginning, it doesn't have a location. It gives birth.
So why don't we just call it God then? So it's God.
One way to think of it is God, but it's not the traditional God. It's not a God that sits there, that, a Semitic warrior with a long beard.
Yeah.
Why are you raising your voice?
Oh, to just to outshine him.
Could I try? I think I can explain maybe some of the talking past each other that's going on here. So as far as, and I'm not going to take a stance, I'm just going to try to explain the two different positions. So I think from Christof's point of view, since he's an idealist, everything, whether it's us or an atom or a bit of a stone or something, all of it is ultimately something to do with consciousness. It's part of, it can only exist because there is consciousness or mind.
I find it difficult to explain. I don't have a good rational explanation.
But how does this defeat physicalism? Because you know it very well. People who have out-of-body experiences report exactly these things, and we can replicate
Oh, because
them.
physicalism is simply inadequate to the job. So you can take Heather's argument and say, okay, it has failed to explain. Let's acknowledge it failed to explain consciousness. Okay, so it has failed to explain. So this is what got me involved with Francis Crick 40 years ago. I said, how can it be, Francis, that the phenomena the filter through which we see all of this reality, consciousness, is left out of science? There's a huge hole at the center of science that it leaves out. Well, any theory of everything, right? People look for the theory of everything that doesn't explain this isn't a theory of everything. It's a theory of mechanisms, of being a car mechanics, all of that. That's fine. But it doesn't really explain what truly fundamentally exists.
May I?
Psychic, right? We've all had that experience. My best friend, we call each other at the same time. I call somebody, did you land? Yes, I just landed. Whatever it is. Okay, so then they said, we're going to look at this experimentally. And they had programs, ESP programs at Princeton and valid psychology departments doing all these experiments to try to find telepathy, ESP, whatever. Nothing came up.
That's not true.
Oh, well, actually, I know yours. Okay.
Well, there's the Gansfeld paradigm. There was meta-analysis with thousands of participants, and it's statistically significant. Now you could question the authenticity of the character of the researchers or the key hacking and stuff like that, but the evidence is at least suggestive. To say there's no evidence is a misstatement of.
Then I take that
and
back.
there is the telepathy tapes, which some people may.
You were telling me about that last night. So, fine, that's great. Then I'd say let's explore that more and keep testing and whatnot. But they at least started a program and started looking at it experimentally. And I am curious as to let's.
8 valence electrodes, so they're all inert, but they have different anesthetic potency in mice. Never been done in humans. So if we can verify this isotope effect of xenon that does affect consciousness, of course, that would be a big deal. If we can do that empirically, that would be a big deal, because that would really tell us that very subtle, the difference is, by the way, the isotopes that have nuclear spin, different from 0, 1/2 and 3/2, they have lower anesthetic potency than the ones that have no nuclear spin, which is really very interesting. So that can be verified empirically in being tested now in flies and organoids. That would at least tell us we need quantum mechanics to understand something in your biology.
See, that I would like that explanation. But the idea, and then Jonathan, and then Stephanie.
Quantum mechanics works in photosynthesis, and it works for migrating birds, so they're magnetic fields. So it does exist already.
I believe I can still talk to my grandmother when she's dead. Do I think she exists in another form? Scientifically, no. So from a science perspective, where we're looking at what is the evidence to explain this phenomena that occurs, we don't have an adequate explanation, but it doesn't mean, there's nothing to point to say that it has to be a non-physical explanation.
Yes,
That's a God of the gaps argument.
No.
What?
Okay. Well, then you're not giving any argument. You're saying we simply don't know. We simply don't know. But physicalists never say that. They're incredibly arrogant. They say, oh, I can explain everything. There's nothing in the world above and beyond atoms and the void. Going all the way back to Democritus.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Gulen.
Skewed and biased because we're viewing the world through this lens that's there's no actual picture of the world in your head, right? It's black in there. It's just a series of ones and zeros that then constructs a picture of the world, which is a distortion, which is changed by biases and hormones and your history and all of that, right? So we all, Christof, we do this podcast together called The Science of Perception Box, how we all see the world through our own lens, our own perception box. So I can stimulate an out-of-body experience. I can stimulate a certain part of your brain and create an out-of-body experience. We could create a near-death experience. So just because you have these mystical experiences, they feel really real, doesn't mean they actually are real. So let's say you take a certain psychedelic drug and you feel like, oh my God, I shot through time and I spoke to these spirits and the ancestors and whatever. Doesn't mean that actually is a real realm of existence. It could just be a creation of your mind. There's this saying, a friend of ours, Anil said, is that, a person sitting there, I'm the only one, none of you agree on that. That's my own internal hallucination. But we come together, we call it reality. So it's all a hallucination. So I'm very skeptical of looking at one person's subjective experience and making, and speculating about how the brain works based on that. I had this debate once with Deepak Chopra. I encourage you to watch it. It's online. I won because science was on my side. But his concept was that consciousness exists in the universe and it instantiates matter. And the classic neuroscience perspective is that matter creates consciousness. And as much as I want it to be the other way around, there's no evidence yet to show that. And so, what I said also to
evidence
Deepak.
is right before in our eyes. Most
Okay,
people
wait,
refuse to see
subjectively.
it.
So I said to
The
Deepak,
only way even I know exists.
how do you get to these insights? And he said, I get to them through these deep states of meditation. But I could get to the spaghetti monster in my deep state of meditation, and it doesn't mean that. Just because, okay, let's say spooky action at a distance or quantum entanglement, right? You have these two particles, they can be separated by huge amounts of space, by a light year, we talked about last night. Yet, the second you look at this one particle, and if it's facing up, the other one is facing down. And they're connected somehow, and we can't explain how yet. So there's this spooky things that happen at the quantum level. And that somehow, because we don't understand the neural basis of consciousness or how physical matter creates, that somehow the fact that these spooky things happen in quantum mechanics relates to consciousness. There's no, we don't have an explanation of how that's related. So it's just sort of equating mysterious things with one another. But there's no causal,
I'm not equating them.
Okay.
All I'm saying, there's something down there.
Okay.
At the rock bottom, the best description of nature that we have, which is at the quantum level, that is fundamentally inimical and non-reconcilable with the naive materialism. Doesn't make sense to me. So my feeling is that probably at way at the bottom and way at the top, those are probably closely related. But right now, ultimately that is an empirical question. Do we need quantum mechanics to understand consciousness, including the neural correlates of consciousness? That's an empirical question that will be answered.
So you did write a paper. I'm going to use your own arguments against you now, but where
I was young.
You still are. You still are.
There was a paper you wrote which said that basically the qualities that the things that occur at the quantum level don't scale up to whether a neuron fires or not, and because also the temperature of the brain. So once you jump from quantum to classic physics, you lose any of that spookiness that's happening at the quantum level.
That is correct. That's a majority opinion in my field, in the field of neuroscience. However, anything that physics doesn't explicitly forbid or rules out might. So it may well be true, as many people have survived, Penrose, Hameroff, and others, right? That quantum entanglement is key. It's an empirical question.
Okay.
I'm not saying I have the answer, but it's a big open question. And my main point is we don't really know what physicalism means, what it entails way down at the bottom. We don't.
Okay. I'm going to get to your third argument too. And then also I'm going to ask, so what are the other possible explanations then if it's a non-physical explanation? But before that, the last argument was this, having a mystical experience, which I've had as well, whether drug or non-drug related, assisted, whatever. And it feels really real, right? But our reality is a construct of the brain. We know this when we look at years of study of neuroscience and neurology. When you have a brain lesion, it changes how you perceive reality, right? And even your sense of self is a construct of the brain. So our perception, there's the physical world out there, and then there's how our
with consciousness. So that's problem number one. David Chalmers calls this the hard problem, and it is a hard problem. The second problem that has emerged with the rise of quantum mechanics, it used to be very easy in classical physics to define what is physical. I mean, it's matter, and matter has well-defined states like position and momentum, and you can describe everything independent of any observer. But we all know since about 100 years, in fact, we just had the anniversary, there is quantum mechanics and what Einstein used to call spooky action at a distance that we now know is a fact. So in other words, you can have, entangled quantum states, let's see, to spin up, spin down, that are in these weird superposition, and they can be separated by light year. Right? And as soon as you observe one, then bingo, instantaneous, independent of the distance, the state of the other is determined. Well, that's certainly not my grandfather's materialism. That's a very strange form of materialism. Okay, so physicists respond to that in a variety of ways, up to including, there was just an article in Nature Physics, denying the possibility that they're truly observer-independent state. So if that's true, that would imply that it is simply impossible to describe anything in isolation from being observed. It simply doesn't make sense. I mean, that's one position, it's not the consensus. And then there is this extra physicalist evidence that I had, which really triggered this sort of this conversion, this transformative experience. I had what William James, or what's today called a mystical experience, where suddenly you encounter another reality, whose, to use the language of William James, whose authority you cannot deny. You come back. James has a beautiful term.
Some say it's already been explained, like, Dennett and Consciousness Explained. Some people explain away consciousness itself. I remember having at one of these actually sci-fu events, I did a sort of session and Larry Page came and we were talking about consciousness, and then he said, I don't even know what you mean by this consciousness. Like, we can just put it in the algorithm. And I said, like feeling. I mean, this was a very disturbing conversation for me, but, like the feeling of pain, right? That is a subjective state. And it's something that feels non-material, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it is just because it feels that way. So when we look at this explanatory gap, there's a sort of a God of the gaps argument, and this is this concept that anything we haven't explained yet by science, then that's where God is, or that's where the mystery is and the mysticism, until we explain it, right? It used to be a weather pattern, so you can do certain dances and get the weather. Then we figured out the science of it, and it was no longer the gods making the weather, right? So the idea is that just because we haven't explained it yet doesn't...
It's a pure promissory note. Yeah, in the fullness of time.
We may or may
I
not
don't live in the fullness of time. I live now. I want an explanation now.
Yeah, but do you want a correct explanation? Okay. We might. I mean, since Descartes, we've been asking this question, and we haven't found the answer.
It's about time. It's 400 years.
It might be there's.
What do we do?
There might be some physical things that we don't understand yet about physics. The other thing is, look, what was your second argument? The quantum mechanics. Okay.
So she's the bad cop.
Now I'm the bad cop. We had this discussion last night. Great, I have to be the bad cop. This whole thing is actually, like I said, very surreal because our roles have been reversed. But okay, so the first argument, which Christof alluded to, is sort of the hard problem of consciousness. So for those of you who don't know, like Dave Chalmers, philosopher, came up with this concept, the easy problem of consciousness. The easy problem, which is not so easy, and we haven't cracked it yet, but theoretically we can, is can you sort of map every conscious experience you have to a specific set of neurons firing in the brain, right? And you would have this exact one-to-one correlation between specific neurons firing and your mental experience, let's say, or your feeling. Theoretically, we can do that, ultimately. But then the hard problem is, why is it that these physical mechanisms and the neurons, firing and neurochemicals slushing around can give us what feels like this non-physical mental experience, and that's the sort of
physicalism as the metaphysical belief that ultimately everything is reduced to the physical. This used to be known as materialism, right through the early 20th century, and then when physics decided, well, there isn't not only matter and material, but there's also energy and space and time and information. So all of that we today call physicalism. And most scientists, like I used to be, are physicalists. All right, but so physicalism suffers from two serious defects or issues or unresolved dilemmas. And then there's a third source of knowledge about the world that I want to briefly describe. So the first problem, and that problem has been apparent, at least to me and to many people, going back all the way to Leibniz 400 years ago, that materialism or physicalism fails to explain how the
experience. And everything we experience from the moment we wake up until we go back to a deep, dreamless sleep. So that became my mission. When I was going through graduate school, you couldn't really study consciousness scientifically. It wasn't taken seriously as a scientific discipline. till this paper came along that was written by Christof Koch over here, along with Francis Crick, who is the co-discoverer of DNA. And they set out this they mapped out this, they said we can study it scientifically. They labeled it the looking for the neural correlates of consciousness, or the NCC. And because you had, Francis Crick, this heavyweight, respected scientist, Christof, who was a young, I think, postdoc at the time when they first met, it legitimized this, and that sort of began this field of the neural basis of consciousness. Then after my graduate work at Oxford, there was a meeting of the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness where I first met Christof. And this was probably so I'm going to start just with a personal story about how I got interested in trying to understand the neural basis of consciousness. I was 5 years old, and I realized for the first time I had this real visceral sensation that I was going to die one day, and it really scared me. And I thought, well, as a way to cheat death, can I keep my thoughts, right? And I asked my dad the next day, I kind of wanted to keep my consciousness, right? This idea of an eternal soul, whatever you want to call it. I said to my dad, who's a physician, where do my thoughts come from? He said, they come from your brain. I said, how? And because I want to keep them when I die. And he said, we don't know. And I was like, what can I be when I grow up to understand this and to figure it out? Basically, again, to cheat death. So basically, my whole career has been driven by anxiety. But that became my mission, was to try to understand the neural basis. And suddenly our roles have reversed. And now Christof is entertaining, as this hard-nosed Germanic physicist, these alternative explanations that perhaps consciousness is not necessarily rooted in the physical world, in matter. And I'm searching for evidence for that because I desperately want that, but I have not found any convincing evidence yet. So we're going to the way we're going to structure this is we're going to engage in a little bit of a dialogue. Christof is going to give his more alternative explanations. I'll give some arguments against that, and then we'll open it up to questions and discussion from everybody. So.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Sounds good.